My pleasure to turn the podium over to Dr. Cerf.
Very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I noticed that many of you came here and had lunch, which proves my favorite theorem, number 208, which reads, if you feed them, they'll come. And so here you are. Now, I have about half an hour-ish to go through 50 years of history, plus some stuff beyond that. It's going to be a little hard. Set your modems for about 50 gigabits a second. First, I want to take you back. Many people say, oh my God, things are changing too fast. We're all going crazy. I can't keep up. I want you to imagine it's 1895 and Henri Becquerel has just discovered radioactivity. Electric and internal combustion engines are just now emerging at that time frame. 6 years from then, Marconi will demonstrate intercontinental wireless technology. You don't need wires to do telegraphy anymore. And 8 years later, from 1895, the Wright brothers will demonstrate heavier than air aircraft. I mean, none of this stuff would have been thought, conceivable. And when it happened, I'm sure if you and I were there, we'd be saying, what's next? Well, in fact, what's next is Einstein, who produces those 4 papers in 1905, and he blows up physics. He blows up Newtonian physics. Of course, he gets blown up, too, a little later on by the quantum guys. Then the string theory guys come along, but that's off into the future. So the point I want to make is that even though we are living in a very intense period of technological evolution and maybe revolution, those who preceded us probably felt the same way. So without going through all of the other lists here, I'm sure everyone in this room remembers many of these milestones and can appreciate that things have rapidly evolved over the past 100 years and will undoubtedly rapidly evolve over the next 100. But let's go back about 50 years or so to 1969. I was a graduate student at UCLA, and my job was to write software for a Sigma 7 computer to connect it to this newfangled idea called the ARPANET, which uses packet switching instead of circuit switching to communicate. So circuit switching is what the telephone system used to do. Packet switching is more like electronic postcards. Anything you know about a postcard applies to an internet packet. So the Sigma 7 machine that I was programming is in a museum somewhere, and some people think I should be there too, but here I am. This is what a packet switch looked like. It was the size of a refrigerator in a very heavy-duty metal encasing because this project was sponsored by the Department of Defense. And they knew when they delivered this particular piece of equipment, it was going into an extremely hostile environment, a collection of graduate students, and any of you who are in that understand how hostile that can be. We were not shy about trying to do some ambitious things. So in addition to building the ARPANET out of dedicated telephone circuits connecting the little packet switches to each other, we also were working on mobile packet radio. This was the van that was used to test the packet radio idea. You're carrying in your pockets and purses the thing which took us a truck to carry. Those 4 white boxes are cubic foot. They cost $50,000 each. And the van was driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway testing digital packet communication for the first time. And we were also pretty ambitious because we were doing this in anticipation of the Defense Department's need for computers in command and control. So we knew that they would need voice, video, and data. They would need mobility, as well as the digitizing of everything. So we were testing packetized voice way back in the early 1970s, early to mid-1970s. You can see the high-tech telephone we used there in the bottom, the little Mickey Mouse thing. By the way, I want to acknowledge that David Tatel is here. And David, I will do my best to try to say what's on the slides for you, because I know you can't see them. So we're seeing the inside of the packet radio van. Oh, I have to tell you, that van had no markings on it at all. And it used to drive up and down the Bayshore Freeway, and we would stop, and the engineers who was driving would get out and go into the back to join everybody else and run tests to see how the shot noise from the cars going by affected our packet transmissions. So one day the story is a policeman noticed this van with no markings on it and a stacked dipole array antenna sticking out the top. And nobody's in the cab, so he goes around and knocks on the back door. And the door opens up, and there are a bunch of guys with beards and geeky stuff and a whole bunch of radios. And he says, who are you? And somebody says, oh, we work for the government. and the policeman says, which government? But officer, we were only going 50 kilobits a second. So just to illustrate how primitive this technology was, in 1994, the 25th anniversary of the ARPANET, my colleagues, Steve Crocker and John Postel and I, for Newsweek magazine, spent the entire day putting this shot together. We had to go get zucchinis and yellow squash and plastic cable, 5-pound tins of coffee, and the backdrops and everything else. And you'll notice that there's a geek joke in this picture because there's no mouth to ear. It's ear to ear and mouth to mouth. And so this would never work. So part of this story, an important part of this story is for you to appreciate the kind of layer cake architecture of the ARPANET and the internet. At the bottom of this thing, there are ways of moving bits around. You know what they are. There are light signals that go off and on. There are radio waves. There are wires that transmit electrons. There are a variety of ways of getting things to represent bits. So that's the physical layer of the system. The next layer up is the way of formatting those bits into frames so that we know where does it begin and where does it end. Nothing more than that. The internet layer is, of course, the core to the entire internet architecture, and that's the place where you get to say, oh, this is like an electronic postcard. An internet packet has a from address, it has a to address, and it has some content, just like a postcard. And just like a postcard, when you put a postcard into the post box, there's no guarantee it comes out the other end. This is called best efforts communication. Now, if you put 2 postcards in going to the same place, they don't necessarily come out in the same order that they came in, and internet packets are just like that. And, then there's another thing that the internet does that, as far as I know, the post office doesn't do. Sometimes you put in 1 packet and 2 of them come out because the system is retransmitting if it thinks something got lost. So that layer is really important. And the interesting thing, well, I'll come back to that. I just want you to have this picture in your head. That there are layers. And the next layer up, of course, is moving bits reliably from one computer to another. And then, of course, somebody wants to do something with it. That's the application layer. So this is the cool thing about the internet design. The first thing is that the internet packets don't know how they're being carried. They don't care whether it's radio or hardwire or a laser or something else. They also don't have a clue about what they're carrying. All they know is they have this bag of bits. And the reason that turned out to be so important is that because it's an uninterpreted payload, if you wanted to change the applications, you don't change the network because the network doesn't know what the applications are. It's the interpretation of the bits at the ends that helps form the application. So the internet layer is completely insensitive to applications. And as time has gone on, as the system has run faster and gotten bigger, we've been able to support applications that we did not think of 50 years ago. And it has not required that the network itself or the internet layer change. The other thing that's so important about the evolution of the net is that at each layer, if you didn't like what you saw there, you were allowed to add a new protocol, add a new functionality in that layer. And we've added a number of protocols in each of the various layers. Like when we swept optical fibers into the lowest layer, we didn't have to change everything else because all they cared about was, can you carry some bits from point A to point B with some probability greater than 0? And even better, if you didn't like the layers we had, you could add a layer. And that's what Tim Berners-Lee did in 1991 when he invented the World Wide Web. He added a layer called the Hypertext Transport Protocol, HTTP, and some of you probably remember HTTPS for security. But he had the freedom to do that. The freedom of this architecture is that other people can contribute their ideas and try them out, and it doesn't interfere with everybody else. So this was a very critical feature of the internet design, and it's what led Tim Berners-Lee to put the World Wide Web on top as what is now one of the most popular applications. I've already summarized part of what Internet Protocol is about. But some people say, well, why would you want a network that loses packets, gets them out of order, and sometimes duplicates them? And the answer is, well, it works fast, but not perfectly. So you put another layer on top, and that's called the transmission control protocol. And the easiest way to explain that to you is to imagine for a moment that you have a book that you want to send to someone, but the post office only carries postcards. So what would you do? Well, you cut the pages out of the book, and you cut them up to fit on the postcards. Then you'd notice that there are no page numbers on some of them, so you'd number all the postcards because you know they could get out of order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you'd keep copies because you know some of them might get lost. And then you start sending them postcards, and then you wonder, how do I know if my friend got them? And then you have this brilliant idea. Your friend could send you a postcard saying, I got everything up to postcard number 420. Except then that postcard might get lost, so then what? And so the answer is you look at your watch, and if you haven't heard anything for a while, you start sending copies until you finally do get a postcard. So now you know how the internet works. It was, I left out a few little examples like domain names and mapping into IP addresses and all that other stuff. But that's sort of fun. Oh, there is one other little thing. What would happen if the post office took your book, which is now 2,000 postcards, and it delivers them all at the same time on the same day, and they don't fit in the post box? So some of them fall on the ground, and the dog eats them, or the wind blows them away. So you have a deal with your friend, and you say, listen, I won't send more than 300 postcards at a time until I get an acknowledgement back from you so it'll all fit in the post box. That's called flow control. And that's it. You know how the internet works. There'll be a final exam on Thursday. Now, the success of the ARPANET, led Bob Kahn, who was one of the key architects of the ARPANET, to come and visit me at my Stanford office in 1973, saying, we're going to use this stuff to support command and control. Computers are going to be in aircraft, ships at sea, and mobile vehicles. We already have a mobile radio network running in the San Francisco Bay Area. He has a packet satellite system running over the Atlantic. And we have the ARPANET, which looks like it's swallowing up the packet satellite net. It was extended into Europe in 1973 with an internal satellite link, a synchronous satellite link. So I'm now running this program at ARPA. I'm in Washington, and I want to show off the TCP/IP protocols. So we set up this demonstration. The packet radio van is going up and down the Bayshore Freeway, firing packets through a gateway into the ARPANET. It goes all the way across the ARPANET, through the satellite hop, internal satellite hop, all the way to Norway and then down to London. And it pops out of the ARPANET at that point, and it goes to another gateway, which goes into the packet satellite network, which takes the packet all the way back to the United States through another synchronous satellite hop, lands in a ground station on the East Coast, goes back into the ARPANET, and goes all the way to Los Angeles. Now, the packet radio van is 400 miles north of Los Angeles, but the packet went 100,000 miles because it went up and down twice through two synchronous satellite hops. I'm in my office at Stanford, or at Washington, D.C. at ARPA, and I'm jumping up and down saying, it works, as if it couldn't possibly have worked. Listen, you know what software is. It's a miracle when software works, so I was really happy about it. So that was a really important demonstration that persuaded us that maybe we actually had something that could work. Well, here's something important. The government turns out to have been a key player. ARPA, of course, part of DoD, initiated this whole project. As it's working, finally, other organizations in the government said, you know what, this looks like it'd be a good thing to have. The National Science Foundation says, we've got 3,000 universities and 5 supercomputers. Wouldn't it be neat if we could connect them all together? So they initiate the NSFNet backbone development. I want to acknowledge Franz Cordova over there, the previous director of NSF, and an enthusiast for this sort of thing. So they get their system up and running with 13 regional networks to connect the universities to the regional nets connected to the NSFNet backbone. Department of Energy says, we've got labs, we need to hook them together. Let's do that, and we'll build the Energy Sciences Network. And NASA says, we've got labs, we want to connect them together. They build the NASA Science Internet, and they interconnect all of them to the ARPANET. So now we have a 4-backbone network internet running in the mid to late 1980s. So this is, now at this point, the only people that can get access to this thing are researchers that are supported by these various government agencies. And because I don't have time to tell you all the details, at some point in around 1988, 89, we got permission to allow commercial traffic to flow on the government backbone. This is what the internet looks like now. I'm cheating a little. This is actually a picture from 1999. It's constructed out of the backbone routing system, so we could see the tens of thousands of networks that are all interconnected. The point I want to make here is that the different colors are the different networks, thousands of them. They all get to choose what hardware they're going to use. They get to choose what software they're going to use. They get to choose who they connect to and on what terms and conditions. They get to choose whatever business model they want. Could be nonprofit, for-profit, government-operated. And it all works. And the reason it works is they all agree to use the same set of standardized protocols. And in fact, 80% of all the agreements here are handshake agreements. It's not even signed contracts. It's just you carry my traffic and I'll carry your traffic. And it's amazing when you think about it that this actually works, and you and I are relying on this every day. I'm sure if I told myself, my younger self, that's how it was going to work, I would have thrown myself out of the lab. Now, I really don't have a lot of time left here, so I want to just make a few points about how the system has evolved. It's almost organic. Whenever it looks like we needed another institution, we invented it. But we didn't invent them ahead of time. We invented them when it was clear you needed one to do something. So the Internet Architecture Board got invented to kind of oversee the evolution of the Internet architecture and protocols. The Internet Engineering Task Force does the standardization work. The Internet Research Task Force does more advanced projects that are not quite ready for standardization. The regional internet registries allocate IP addresses uniquely to people who need them. The internet service providers provide services to users. Internet exchange providers link the internet service providers together. The Internet Society got created in 1992 to support the Internet Engineering Task Force and the IAB. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers gets invented in 1998 to oversee the allocation of domain names and IP addresses and the businesses that arose out of those activities. It just goes on and on. The Internet Governance Forum gets invented in 2005 when governments have discovered that there is this thing called an Internet Society. They start the World Summit on the World Summit on the Information Society in 2003. First question is, what's an information society? And these are all government representatives, and one guy says, well, it's kind of like the internet. And they said, who's in charge of the internet? The first question that most politicians would ask, or legislators. And we said, nobody, it's a distributed system. They didn't believe us. And so then they discovered ICANN, and then they discovered I was chairman of the board. They discovered I was in charge of the internet. Then they decided who's in charge of me, and it turns out we had a contract with the National Telecommunications Information Agency, so NTIA must be in charge of the internet. Who's in charge of that? Well, the Department of Commerce. Who's in charge of the Department of Commerce? The President of the United States. So it must be the President that's in charge of the internet. The debate went on. The Internet Governance Forum was formed to continue the discussion for the last 18 years, and we're meeting in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia to continue the debate. But anyway, this is a very diverse ecosystem with many, many different players, and that makes it so complicated and so interesting. Well, if I go through these, it'll take too much time, and I'm told I have only about 10 minutes left. So let me just say that one of the most important features of the internet is its transnational architecture. The packets don't know when they have crossed an international boundary. It's by design. They don't know. The consequence of that is that the internet touches every country and every part of the world, and that means the people have the ability to interact with each other anywhere in the world, just like you should be able to make a phone call and talk to anyone that you want to talk to. The internet, the networks, the hosts of the internet, your devices, your mobiles, and everything else can get anywhere they want to go on the internet. We should keep that property, and there are some people who would like to draw boundaries, or geopolitical boundaries around the network and stop the flow of traffic. That'll, first of all, wreck the World Wide Web, but it'll also mess up all of the sharing of information, the e-commerce that goes on, and everything else. So keeping the network open is very important, and that's why this Internet Governance Forum and the Global Digital Compact, which is under discussion at the UN, are so important to us to keep this internet fully connected and fully open. I was going to go through a whole bunch of technologies, but I don't feel I have time to do that. However, I do want to talk a little bit about all the massive amount of data that we are accumulating because we have so many different ways of generating information, whether it's CT scans, astronomical information, sensors everywhere, business information. There's just tons and tons of data. And we're learning how to use all that data. And in fact, one of the ways to use it is artificial intelligence, and we'll come to that in just a moment. One thing I will say is that all of this connectivity, all this computing power, all of the ability to amplify signals have led to some consequences that we didn't anticipate. We dropped the barriers to communication to practically zero in the construction of the internet and the World Wide Web. And that's a good thing generally, except that it meant that the bad guys also were able to amplify their impact on the rest of the society that's connected to the network. So now we have to struggle with harmful behavior on the net, while at the same time trying to protect its connectivity and ubiquity so that we can take advantage of all the tools that we've used in the past, Wikipedia and all the other things. So we're struggling now with trying to cope with harmful uses of the network and figuring out how to do this on an international basis, because the perpetrator of harm could be in one jurisdiction and the victim in another. So we need international cooperation and the ability to identify harmful behavior in those parties, whether it's an individual or an organization or even a country. So anonymity, which has been a common property of the internet, is not a perfect solution. We actually need to peel away the veil of anonymity at need and under the right circumstances to hold parties accountable for their bad behavior. So that last bullet, trans-border crimes, are a big issue. There's a crime treaty being put together now, debated and negotiated, to deal exactly with this kind of computer crime or cybercrime scenario. Okay, so you have to have AI, right? Everybody's talking about AI. AI has been around since the 1960s, but it went in 3 phases. The first one was a kind of heuristic programming, which all that means is that it doesn't always work. And so if it doesn't always work, it's AI. If it works all the time, it's engineering. So that was our first attempt, but it didn't work out terribly well. It didn't scale all that well. So then we came up with another idea called expert systems, where we pluck knowledge out of the heads of experts and formulate it in a rule of if this, then that. And you have a collection of if this, then that rules, and they cycle along and trigger each other. So you ask a question at the beginning, and it kind of bounces through over here, and you get an answer on the other end. That worked out for a while, but then the rule set got so big that the rules started to conflict with each other, and at some point you couldn't tell whether the answers you were getting were really reliable or not. So that didn't scale up very well either. And then comes neural networks. They started out with a single neural network around 1964 or so, and it didn't do much. And then everybody said, well, no, that's not a very useful technology. But when the hardware was invented that allowed you to have 100 or 300 or 500 layers of neural nets, now suddenly you could do things. And that's where we are today. We have multi-layer neural networks that do some pretty amazing things. There's a company called DeepMind, which Google, my company, acquired a few years back. They put a program together called AlphaGo, which learned how to play Go so well that it beat Grandmaster Lee Sedol 4 games out of 5. And that was pretty astonishing because Go has more states in it than chess does. Then they invented AlphaZero, which starts out with no knowledge of anything except Go, plays it itself until it becomes an expert. It was better than the original AlphaGo. And then AlphaFold comes along, and we figure out how to fold proteins that are produced by interpreting DNA, turning it into messenger RNA, et cetera, et cetera. So now they figured out how to fold 200 million proteins that could be generated by human DNA, which means you have this giant catalog now. And if you're looking for, say, a small molecule to interfere with a particular disease process, you might be able to find one in the catalog and then use that to prevent someone from being harmed by a disease. So this is all pretty exciting stuff. And for entertainment, the chatbots are fabulous. I mean, I don't know if any of you have tried this out, but it's a lot of fun to just present a chatbot with a prompt. By the way, that's a new job, prompt engineering, believe it or not. That's a job that didn't exist. It's like webmasters. Webmasters didn't exist until the World Wide Web came along and they learned from each other. Now the people who are doing prompt engineering are learning from each other as well. So you can produce entertaining stories. I asked it to write a little story about an alien that got into my wine cellar. And they wrote a story about a little Martian who showed up somehow. It didn't say exactly how, but it was surviving on my Cabernet, and I discovered it, because the bottles were empty. So that was a nice little story. But then I thought I would test this a little more, because people have said to me, that sometimes these large language models hallucinate. That's an official technical term, in case you didn't know that. So I thought, well, let's test that theory. So I said, why don't we have it write an obituary for me? And I know that sounds kind of sad, but I figured the obituary form would have been known to the chatbot that ingested all these examples from the internet. And it had, there's stuff about me on the internet. You shouldn't believe all of it, by the way. And so it wrote an obituary, a little 700-word obituary. And it starts out, we're sorry to report Dr. Cerf passed away. And then it gave a date, which I thought was way too soon. And then it summarized my career, but it conflated what I did with what other people did. And it gave me credit for stuff I didn't do, gave other people credit for what I did. And then it got to the family member part, and it made up family members. As far as I know, I don't have. So I'm sitting here scratching my head, thinking, how the hell does that happen? And I realized that what's missing from the training is it just sucks in this huge amount of stuff and figures out what words and phrases are likely to occur near each other or within some distance of each other. And it takes that statistical model, and it takes the prompt that you give it, and it generates output based on this very complex statistical model of, in some cases, 1 trillion parameters. So I realized that what happens is that it doesn't know context. So let's say, France, let's suppose that your bio and my bio are on the same page, which they might be because we were both associated with NSF for a while. It could pluck something out of your bio and something out of mine, not realizing that this paragraph is yours and this paragraph is mine, and combine them. And so this ability to hallucinate seems very, very understandable. So I've been thinking about doing a video to pretend to be Sigmund Freud. I kind of look a little bit like that. What we have now is the artificial id and the artificial ego. What we are yet missing is the artificial superego to control the uncontrollable impulses of the artificial id. And then I would take out a cigar. Well, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So I figured that will help people understand the peculiarities of these systems. We can make fun of all this, but it's really important technology. We are still exploring how does it work, how does it not work. And so I think the idea now should not be to control the technology itself, but to control how it's used. And so if you're going to use it for entertainment, fine. There might be some fights about intellectual property. But if you're going to use it for medical advice, that's more risky. And we should ask questions of companies that might try to do that and say, okay, show us how you mitigated the risk of that high-risk application using these technologies. So that's where I stand on what we should do about this stuff. I'm going to take a few minutes and then to tell you where we are. This is not Google. This is me, NASA, ESA, JAXA, and CARI on the design and implementation of a solar system-wide internet. In '97, the Pathfinder landed on Mars after 20 years of unsuccessful landings. Some of you will remember 96 or 76, and the Viking landers on Mars, very successful, very exciting. So when the little rover Sojourner landed in '97, I got very excited, and I went out to the Jet Propulsion Lab to talk to the communications guys who were supporting communications back to Mars, to Earth from Mars, for that Pathfinder and Sojourner. We got all excited, and then we said, what should we be doing now, that is to say 1998, that we're going to need 25 years from now? And we concluded we should design and build a solar system-wide internet to support manned and robotic space exploration. So that's what we've been doing since 1998. So we actually ended up in 2004. Remember when the Spirit and Opportunity landed in January? The radios on those rovers overheated, and they were only going to deliver 28 kilobits a second of capacity back to Earth. And when the radios started to overheat, the engineers said, well, we'll back off on the duty cycle and slow the rate at which data could be transmitted back. And the scientists are getting really grumpy about that. One of the engineers said, well, you know, there's an X-band radio on the rovers, and there's an X-band radio on the orbiters that we sent 2 years before to map the surface of Mars to figure out where the rover should go. So we said, well, we have some prototype software that you could upload if you want to, that would allow the rover to hold on to the data that it had collected until an orbiter comes overhead, squirt the data up to the orbiter, and the orbiter hangs on to the data until it gets to the right place in its orbit to transmit back to the deep space net. The orbiters are close to the surface of Mars, so they could go at 128 kilobits a second. The orbiters are outside of the thin atmosphere of Mars, bigger antennas, more power, transmit data back to the big 70-meter deep space net at 128 kilobits a second. So the store and forward packet-switched prototype network has delivered all the traffic back from the rovers since the arrival of Spirit and Opportunity. So we've been working, this team at NASA, the labs at JPL, and now also with the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans, on the implementation of a new suite of protocols that we call delay and disruption tolerant networking. We thought we could use TCP/IP, works on Earth, you know, it ought to work on Mars, probably would, except there's this little problem. It's called the distance between the planets. It's literally astronomical. And if you do the math, you discover that, you know, Earth and Mars are some 220 million miles apart when we're farthest apart in our orbits. It takes 20 minutes for a signal going at the speed of light to get there and another 20 minutes to come back. Flow control in TCP is basically, I'm running out of room, please stop sending. And if the guy doesn't hear you for 20 minutes, he keeps transmitting, you know, and this stuff falls on the floor. Oh, and there's another problem. The planets are rotating, and we don't know how to stop that. So you're talking to something on the surface of the planet, and you can't talk to it till it comes back around. Same problem with the orbiters. So we have this delay and disruption tolerant networking protocol we call the bundle protocol, which actually stores information in the network when it can't get further along until the links come back up thanks to the orbital arrangement. So it's different from the internet, which throws things away when it can't find a link to get to the destination. So I think this is my last slide. This is what we think the 2030s will be notionally like. There are a lot of missions that are planned, are already in operation, many others are planned, and we would like to see them take advantage of this new interplanetary protocol. We've been on the International Space Station since 2009. We've been running the prototype software on Mars since 2004. And we are currently running the PACE mission, which was launched for Goddard, which is sensing. It's an Earth sensing system. It's using the bundle protocols. And the Koreans are in the middle of the KPLO experiment, also using them. So we've standardized the protocols in the Internet Engineering Task Force and the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems. And we're ready to go as the Artemis mission unfolds. So that's the next decade or so of internet evolution. I'll stop there. I'll thank you for your time, and I'll try to answer questions if you have any.
I hear you're going to rove the floor. Is that?
Sorry?
You're going to rove the floor?
Well, it depends. I'm hearing impaired, and so sometimes my shtick is to grab a microphone and run around like Geraldo, and because I can get close enough to lip read. The audio is pretty damn good in this room, so let's see how it goes.
Okay.
If there are questions, and if I have trouble, I'll jump off the stage.
Great. So floor is open for questions.
There's one. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the very nice talk and history. Rich Schifrin, Indiana University. Many individuals have said that many of the undesirable characteristics of the internet are due to anonymity, as you mentioned. And I was wondering if you could say a few words about the pluses and minuses of anonymity. Is it possible physically in the system to go back to a non-anonymous system, or is it socially possible to go back to a non-anonymous system?
I'm sorry,
About anonymous, non-anonymous
oh,
systems.
non-anonymous,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay, so you
Relative
and I-
advantages.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I think I wouldn't want to argue that everyone must identify themselves upon, attempting to use the net. In a way, a lot of people do identify themselves to their internet service providers because the internet service provider wants to be paid for providing you access. So it may be hard to be absolutely anonymous. I think, though, an interesting norm might emerge where those people who put information on the net and attest to their identity in a way that we can verify might be considered more credible than the people who put stuff up anonymously. I don't know that we will ever evolve a norm like that, but I know when I'm reading material and I'm trying to figure out how to evaluate it, it seems to me pretty important to know where did it come from. So provenance may turn out to induce some of what you're asking, and I hope that's true, frankly, because I think ultimately we do have to hold parties accountable for bad behavior. Now, when you see the headlines about ransomware and all those other things, what you also might see is from time to time, increasingly, we actually can track those people down because it's actually hard to be absolutely anonymous. So the good news is that we may be able to formulate practices like the Cybercrime Treaty, which involves cooperation across country boundaries, and also technologies in order to identify parties, even if they don't want to be identified. But I'd like to see a norm where identification becomes a badge of credibility. Of course, I can't predict that. Maybe there are sociologists here who can. But that's the sort of thing I hope we will see evolve. Okay, we've got lots of hands up here.
Yes, Joel.
Thank you very much for a marvelous presentation, and thank you for the work you've done over the last decades. My name is Joel Cohen. I'm at Rockefeller University in New York City.
Then you must know, Lederberg, Josh Lederberg.
Indeed, I do.
A dear friend of mine, passed away now. But
yes, great man. Could you please tell us your thoughts about China and the United States, specifically the increasing barriers to communication? I have colleagues in China.
Yes.
And I find increasing numbers of channels closed for communication with them. I'd like to hear your assessment, please.
So I've been watching, of course, this. I have good friends at Tsinghua, for example, and some of the other universities. They have been able to find a variety of ways around what's called the Great Firewall of China. Increasingly, the Chinese are becoming very sophisticated about their mechanisms for preventing people from getting access to the outside world. But it's been my experience, especially now that we have low Earth orbiting satellites and Starlink capabilities, that some people will be able to bypass even the optical fiber network connectivity that China has. They may get in trouble for radiating. I don't want to oversimplify this, but there are more and more ways of getting access to the net, whether it's 4G and 5G on your mobile or Wi-Fi or LEO orbits. And there are ways of hiding in the traffic flow. There's a system called Tor, which stands for the Onion. I forget what the R stood for. Anyway, so the Onion network was developed by the Naval Research Lab, incredibly. I mean, it's used for all kinds of not so good things right now on the dark web, but it was originally designed to help people exfiltrate information from places that didn't want them to. So I don't want to sound too Pollyanna, but my experience with a lot of my Chinese friends is that they get help finding their way out of China one way or another. I hope, frankly, that we get to the point where everybody's a little more comfortable with an open internet, because without it, things don't work. And just to remind you about why connectivity, with everything being able to connect everything, is so important, think about a browser for a moment. You can pretend you're a browser, even if you don't quite know what that actually means. But if you're a browser, one of the things you do is to go to some website and you pull in a file and you interpret the file. And what's in the file could be images, could be text, could be formatting instructions, could be links to other parts of the internet, which you, the browser, go and pull in as you're assembling the page. So when you think about it, the World Wide Web relies on the possibility that it can touch any node, any website, anywhere in the internet in order to respond to your click of the mouse. We need to preserve that property, because if we don't, the whole thing stops working the way it has been. So I hope that we can simultaneously preserve that capability and solve the problem you just raised at the same time.
Thank you. Next question's up in the balcony. Yes.
Barbara Gross from Bethesda. Hi, Vint. So it's amazing. I lived through some of this history. It's amazing to see the motivations behind some of the choices you made and how insightful and brilliant they were. And it's great you're going to outer space. But much of what I hear these days is how we built technologies without thinking about how they could be used for bad things.
Yes.
And we all know what's going on Earth. I'm wondering if, as you're thinking about can we build it to go to outer space, if you're also thinking about should we and how should we do it so perhaps we won't proliferate?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I do have some answers to that. It's clear that the current internet has evolved pretty dramatically. There's more cryptography in the internet now than there ever was when we first started. And I'm not unhappy about not putting it in at the beginning, because I would have been relying on a bunch of graduate students to be disciplined about managing cryptography keys. And I don't think the graduate students, I used to be one, so I'm not insulting anybody here. I don't think they would have been a reliable tool for that, and it would have impeded our ability to figure out whether the system would work at all. So in case of the interplanetary system, the first thing I put up on the whiteboard when we were talking about this idea was a headline saying, 15-year-old takes over Mars net. And I said to the engineers, I do not want that headline to show up in the New York Times. So we introduced end-to-end cryptography and strong authentication tools for the equipment and the software of the interplanetary system, including encryption of the content as well, differentially encrypted, so different parts could be encrypted with different keys. So we're super sensitive to that. Not only because of the desire not to have the system with that headline, but also because it's really expensive to build that system. And it's not, I don't mean to say that it's cheap to build the one that we're using terrestrially, but the interplanetary ones are going to be really expensive. We didn't want to lose all that investment. So, yep, we're paying attention to that one. Sorry.
Okay, yes, next one's here.
Okay. It's David.
Yes. David Tatel from Castleton, Virginia. Vint, that was absolutely delightful and the best description of the internet I've ever heard. So thank you for that. And thank you for also describing your slides. It helped a lot. So this morning's paper reports that the FCC yesterday voted, of course, on a party line vote.
Yes.
To reinstitute the net neutrality regulations and to classify the internet as a public utility and to regulate it as such. I suspect you have some views about that.
Yes, and to be absolutely honest with you, I've kind of shifted somewhat I was a big fan of net neutrality when it looked like the providers of internet service would use their control over your access to favor their own services and to interfere with others. So as an example, let's say you're a cable company, you're offering cable television service, you're also offering internet service, and your customer is trying to do streaming video on the internet service that you offer in competition with your cable service. And so you notice this and you screw up the guy's transmission on the internet side to force your customer to go back to using your video service. That's the kind of scenario that we worry about. There were other situations where telephone companies that were offering internet service noticed that people could make what looked like phone calls over the internet, shocking. And so they basically blocked anything that looked like voice over IP. So those were example scenarios that were not just made up, they were real. And I thought at the time that that was going to be a big issue. Now, some of these issues kind of go away when there's lots of competition, because if the consumers have choice, if they don't like the service they're getting because somehow it's interfering with what they want to do, they can just switch to another service. Well, there are more services available now. We've got our mobiles, we got 5G and 6G, we've got Wi-Fi, we've got low Earth orbiting satellites, and there will be several different flavors of that eventually if the other companies catch up with Starlink. And there's telcos have facilities, optical fiber or DSL. So there's more and more choice. So there may not be as much necessity for invoking the net neutrality rules. The other thing that's really important that David brings up is that they're using Title II, which is a telecom service, basically a telephone service regulation piece of legislation. This is not the telephone system. And so they have to forbear from executing on a whole bunch of detailed regulations that are in Title II. If it were me, I would ask for a new title related to the internet to try to make sure that everyone, you and I, have fair access to the resources of the internet services and have equal access, equal opportunity to get access to it. Now, it might mean that there are different charges for different speeds. It's not that every packet gets treated the same. It's that everyone who is using the service has choice as to how they use it, and that the provider doesn't interfere with that. It's more like a common carriage kind of notion. But that's not where we are right now. Getting this Congress to legislate a new title in the Telecom Act is probably difficult at the moment. And so that's why I think the chairman, the chairwoman, chose to go down this path. But for me, I'd like to see a new title which is specific to internet and assures the freedom and flexibility that we all deserve. Says we
Frank Stewart, the Hebrew University, now in New York. How robust or how fragile is the internet? Specifically, could some bad actor bring about protracted, widespread disruption? So
interestingly enough, we do it to ourselves. There is one part, a really important part of the network is called the border router protocol. And that border router protocol tells all of the rest of the network how it's connected so that they can route traffic through it. And if you give bad information about what you're connected to, you'll attract traffic to the wrong places. This has happened from time to time. Someone has deliberately fabricated border gateway protocol information in order to cause traffic to flow where it doesn't belong. At one point, we thought it was on its way to China, as an example. However, this also happens by accident when engineers are not perfect, and they screw up every once in a while. That's a technical term. And so we occasionally see problems where the routing gets messed up. We're trying to introduce features to make that less likely to happen and also less likely to be exploited by someone deliberately. So we're using strong authentication and cryptography and digital signatures and things along those lines so that the announcements about what's connected to what can be validated. So we register who is responsible for which IP address space. Only that party is allowed to announce their connectivity and routes to that address space. Somebody else is not allowed to claim that they are a destination for that address space. So that's one place where we're making deliberate progress. The internet has been functionally running since January 1, 1983. And although pieces of it have been taken down deliberately, like countries that shut the internet off by cutting off the underlying transport, say during elections, for example, that's a very deliberate act by a government. I don't like that very much, but it's possible to do that. Taking the entire internet down has never happened. I probably shouldn't have just said that, because probably 2 minutes from now somebody will take it all down. It is a remarkably robust system precisely because it's so distributed. The software is quite diverse, So we don't have the problem of everybody running exactly the same piece of code, the same bug that would trigger, a tidal wave of failure. But it is still not as robust as we would like. But it is pretty amazing. I would guess if we asked any of you, there have been times when it wasn't working and you weren't happy about that because it prevented you from getting work done. On the other hand, I would guess a lot of you rely on it every day as much as I do. And it seems to be pretty damn reliable for the last 40 years. So, knock on wood. France Cordova's got her hand up. Oh, okay. No, go ahead. You're fine.
I have
it's
the
just that
mic,
I want to make
but I'll
sure
hand it
that
over.
my former boss gets to say something. Go ahead.
I'll take the mic to her in person. I'm Barbara Yatsok from Berkeley, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how the Great Firewall works, because some things get through and some things don't get through. How do they do that?
Yeah, they are running software at high speed to, France, the microphone's coming your way. There you go. I was thinking of doing it this way, but that's probably not. Okay, so the answer is that they are watching the traffic flowing through the backbone. They are requiring all the traffic to go through certain access points to the rest of the internet, so they have an opportunity to observe that traffic. They also are sometimes insisting that everyone use certain domain name implementations and domain server implementations that they can control so that they can inhibit your ability to get to a particular destination from a DNS lookup. I'm not expert at the details and insides. I'm making some of this up as plausible explanations for what they could do. They've been very sophisticated at doing this. On the other hand, it's amazing how much information still manages to find its way out of those controlled spaces. There's some arguments that some of their companies that are building routers, like Huawei, have been accused of putting special software in there to either surveil the traffic or to somehow be able to interfere with it on command. In spite of all of that, I'm still seeing people finding ways of getting out of the firewall, but it's been a pretty impressive piece of work. Okay,
One more.
We got 3 minutes left at most.
Yeah.
Last
Yes,
question.
and it's France. Go for it.
Yeah. Great, wonderful talk, Vint. So a couple of quick questions. On the ransomware threat, is that getting worse or getting going to get better?
Two metrics. We see more of it is happening against very soft targets like schools and especially hospitals. The medical systems have been interfered with a lot. On the other hand, we're also finding increasingly we can find the people who are doing that. And so there's a real tension there. I would say that we're still seeing an increase in ransomware attacks, but I think we're also finding better and better ways of tracking those folks down. One thing that's a clear response to this is that the parties who are at risk, whose data could be held for ransom, need to implement backup capability that inhibits the success of the ransomware attack. And that needs serious systems engineering. It needs good advice and design. The big cloud companies can actually be very helpful because they're I realize I sound like an advertisement here, but honest to God, the cloud companies have enormous capacity for replication of data and for resistance against these various kinds of attacks. However, you can easily shoot yourself in the foot if you're a customer and you fail to protect your passwords or two-factor authentication, and so the bad guy gets in as if he were you. Now, at that point, it's very hard to fix that problem. So people need discipline in the use of their authentication capabilities. People should be using two factors, not just username and password, but a crypto key or at least, something on your mobile phone, which is not great, by the way. But I think that we are getting closer to better behaviors, but it really requires serious work for the general public and for the private sector to protect against this stuff. You had another question.
Yes. So I think once you said that if you had to do it all over again now, you might redesign a protocol in a different way. Is this the interplanetary method that you described, is that more the direction you would go,
Well,
or were you
well,
thinking of something else?
Actually, if I could use today's technology in 1973, yes, I would do some pretty... some of you may not know this, but the original design had a 32-bit address space, which was enough to identify 4.3 billion terminations in the internet. At the time that Bob and I picked that number, and we did a little back of the envelope, that was more than there were people in the world. And then we thought, well, that ought to be enough for our experiment. And then, of course, the computers proliferated because they got cheaper and smaller and more of them. So now there's a 128-bit address space design, IP version 6. That has 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. That's a number only the Congress can appreciate. And I think that's going to be enough to last until after I'm dead, and then it's somebody else's problem. So if I had whispered in my 30-year-old ear saying, you need 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses, I probably would have thrown myself out of the office. I mean, there aren't that. Oh, I used to say that's enough address space so that every electron in the universe can have its own web page. But then I got an email from a guy at Caltech. Dear Dr. Cerf, you jerk, there's 10 to the 88th electrons in the universe, and you're off by 50 orders of magnitude. So I don't use that story anymore. I think we're out of time.
We're out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. Really great. Yeah, yeah.